Picture this. You're 12 years old, standing barefoot in the morning mist of a quiet Bulgarian valley in 1550. Your mother is baking bread. Your father's hands guide the flock through dew-soaked grass. Then hoofbeats. Not the sound of neighbors, but empire. Your world freezes. Ottoman riders arrive, faces like stone scrolls in hand, eyes scanning children like cattle. And then a finger points at you. You will never return home. You will be renamed, reshaped, and repurposed. This is not fiction. This was reality for thousands of boys taken from villages across Europe and the Middle East, absorbed into the Ottoman Empire's vast machinery of power. Some were trained as warriors, others the most beautiful. The brightest were placed behind the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, not for honor, but for control. This video is not about sultans or conquests. It's about what empires hide, the voices they silence, the innocence they erase, and the systems they build on the backs of children. Stay with me as we uncover one of the darkest and most hidden institutions in history, the making and breaking of palace boys in the heart of Imperial Istanbul. What happens when a child's body becomes a tool of the state, when beauty is currency and obedience is survival? After weeks of brutal marching, half-starved and half-broken, the stolen boys finally arrive at the gates of Istanbul. But this is no rescue. This is the beginning of something far worse than captivity. The sprawling magnificence of Topkapi Palace hides a darker reality. A machine engineered not just to train, but to erase. Behind those ornate walls, boys are stripped of their names, their religions, their languages, and their families. They are given silk robes, fine food, and world-class education, but only if they submit. The Enderun school was praised as a beacon of elite learning. But for those forced into it, it was a crucible of psychological warfare. Every lesson came with a cost. Every privilege was laced with expectation. Your survival didn't depend on brilliance alone, but on your ability to disappear inside the system, to obey without resistance, to smile while being broken. This wasn't just schooling. It was social engineering on a grand scale. And the most terrifying truth: the very boys who survived it often became the ones who enforced it. You were 12 when they took you. Your name was Stefan. Or maybe it was Elias. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore because that name was taken the moment you passed through the gates of the empire. They told you this was the path to greatness, but they didn't tell you what would be sacrificed to get there. Inside the palace, the world was gilded, but the air was heavy with silence, with fear, with the weight of thousands of boys who came before you. Each step across the marble floor echoed like a warning. The walls didn't whisper. They watched. You thought this was a school, but no one prepared you for what you'd have to learn to survive. There was Nikos, the boy from the Greek coast, who smiled too brightly for someone so bruised. He had learned early that flattery kept you fed, that silence could get you killed. He taught you how to walk like you didn't exist, how to avoid the guards' eyes, how to smile when your stomach turned. But one night, he didn't come back to the dormitory. His bed was sty. Then there was some boys surrender. And over the years, the system worked exactly as it was designed. It took frightened boys and turned them into ambitious men. Men who no longer questioned the rules. Men who enforced them. Men who forgot what? But you didn't forget. You remembered every scream in the dark, every name that disappeared, every moment you chose silence to survive. And as we tell these boys' stories one by one, remember these were real children. Erased, renamed, reshaped, not for their own greatness, but for the glory of an empire that only saw them Their stories are not lost, not tonight. We remember them now. What do these stories tell us? Not just about history, but about the world we've built and the human cost we often ignore in the name of empire power or glory. Because this wasn't just a palace, it was a machine, a system engineered not to nurture, but to reshape. Boys weren't educated, they were refashioned, converted, broken down and rebuilt into something useful to the state, to the sultan, to the system. Their minds sharpened, their talents refined, but their humanity erased in the process. Some call it tradition, others civilization. But if you listen closely to the stories echoing through the marble corridors of Topkapi, you'll hear something else entirely. Trauma, institutionalized identity stripped, and childhood lost behind golden gates. And what's even more disturbing, this isn't just an Ottoman story. This is a human story. The tools may have changed, but the blueprint remains. Even today, systems still exist, some cloaked in culture, some in religion, some in policy, that pull children from their families, erase their roots, and shape them into something useful. Isolation, control, obedience. These aren't just remnants of a fallen empire. They're warning signs that still flash across our modern world. Think about how easily we normalize harm when it's dressed in ritual, or how silence can be weaponized when institutions grow too powerful to question. The boys who passed through the Enderun school learned languages, politics, and art, but they also learned that survival sometimes means betraying yourself. That obedience is safer than truth, and that silence is often rewarded more than resistance. We often romanticize royal courts' empires and ancient traditions, but beneath the jewels and silk lies something darker, a legacy of pain masked by opulence. These boys weren't princes, they weren't sons, they were property, currency, assets molded for imperial gain. So what do these stories teach us? They teach us to question power, especially when it's cloaked in grandeur. They remind us that education without empathy is not advancement, it's indoctrination. And most importantly, they demand that we remember, not just the names of kings and empires, but the children buried beneath their shadows. Because history isn't just dates and dynasties. It's also the echoes of footsteps that no longer fall, the silence of voices never allowed to speak, the cost of glory paid in lives we never bothered to count. If this story left you shaken, it's because it should. We often scroll past tales of forgotten empires, assuming they're just dusty pages in an old textbook. But some stories reach out from the past and grab you by the soul, not because they're ancient, but because their shadows still stretch into the present. What happened to those boys behind the palace walls wasn't just historical, it was human. And that's why their story deserves to be heard, shared, and remembered. So if you felt something, anything, while walking through their world, don't let that emotion end here. Hit that like button, not for me, but for them, for the thousands of names we'll never know, and the lives we'll never fully understand. Share this video with someone who needs to see the darker side of power, who still believes history is only about kings and victories, and not about the blood and tears left behind in the marble halls. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not because it's what creators ask, but because we're building something here, a space for stories that matter, stories that unsettle, stories that refuse to die quietly in the footnotes of forgotten regimes. Every time you watch, comment, or share, you help keep these voices alive. And that matters, because silence is what allowed the system to thrive. Silence is what buried their suffering. And silence is what history uses to hide the truth behind golden myths. Let's break that silence together. Tell me in the comments, which part of the story haunted you most? Was it the day the boy was taken, the moment he was renamed? The realization that even survival came with a price too steep for childhood to pay? These aren't just facts, they're fragments of humanity crying out across centuries. And if this is your first time here, welcome. You've just joined a growing circle of seekers, people who don't just want to know what happened, but why it matters. People who believe empathy is more powerful than empire. This is more than content. This is witness. So thank you for being the kind of person who listens when the past whispers, who stops scrolling when the forgotten call out, and who refuses to look away when truth gets uncomfortable. I'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, not every palace is built on peace. Some were built on children's backs. Let's never forget that. So what does it all mean when the marble halls of empire echo with silence? It's not because there's nothing left to say, it's because too much has been buried. Behind the ornate domes and delicate calligraphy of Topkapi Palace lies a truth history prefers to whisper, if it speaks at all, that the price of power was innocence. That beneath every empire's greatness there are graves without names and children without choices. This wasn't just a story about the Ottoman Empire. It was a story about what happens when human lives become tools, when a child's body becomes a currency for ambition, and when trauma is not a side effect, but part of the design. What began as a promise of elite education became a blueprint for institutional abuse. And the most haunting part. It worked. The system produced brilliant minds, loyal administrators, capable governors. But it also produced silence, shame, generational pain disguised as legacy. The boy you followed, he was never just one boy. He was thousands. He was the composite of every child taken from his family, stripped of his name, and remade to serve. He is also every child today, trapped in systems that value obedience over humanity. His story forces us to ask, how much progress have we truly made? Because in a modern world filled with polished institutions and political ceremony, the machinery of dehumanization still hums quieter, now better hidden, but still intact. You may not see marble dormitories or ceremonial conversions, but you will see children reduced to function, to image, to silence. Whether in trafficking rings, exploitative schools, or state systems that fail the most vulnerable. The architecture of power still echoes the same cold logic. Break them young, and they will never remember who they were. But we remember. And that is the beginning of resistance. To tell this story is not to condemn history, it's to unearth it. It's to rescue the forgotten from the archives of denial and to hold their pain up to the light. The Enderun School no longer operates, but the need for critical memory, for ethical reckoning, has never been more urgent. Let the boy's story be a mirror, not just to the past, but to ourselves, because if history is a cycle, awareness is the crack in its wheel. And in that crack, we plant the seed of something different, something human, something that says, never again. What happens when the victim stops fighting and starts participating? That's the final mutation the palace demanded, the ultimate transformation. Not just submission, not just silence, but cooperation. At first you were a boy taken, then a boy broken, then a boy trained, but the last stage was something colder, a boy repurposed. Once you had survived the dormitories, mastered the languages, learned to smile, while suppressing the scream behind your eyes, you were no longer seen as vulnerable. You were seen as useful. This is how the machine kept itself alive. The same halls where you once whispered prayers to a forgotten god were now the same corridors where you were asked to monitor younger boys. The same teachers who had once examined your skin and speech for signs of resistance now asked you to do the same to others. And maybe for a moment you felt pride recognition. But beneath it all was the quiet horror you were becoming, what once terrified you. This was the genius of the system. It did not merely abuse, it recycled, it turned trauma into hierarchy, it made the most broken boys into the most loyal enforcers, because who better to maintain the chain than someone who had felt its sting? Amit, the older boy who had once threatened you in exchange for protection, was now your mentor. But the threat in his eyes had been replaced by something more disturbing: indifference. It wasn't personal anymore. It was procedural. He showed you how to inspect the new arrivals, how to decide which boys were docile, which were promising, which could be guided. You wanted to throw up, but you didn't, because you remembered what happened to those who resisted. You remembered Stephanos. You remembered the boy who disappeared after praying in Greek. You remembered your own pain, and instead of revolting, you compartmentalized. I'm just following orders, you told yourself. But that lie is how every empire survives. The palace did not just erase your identity, it replaced it with duty. And in that duty, many boys found a sick sense of purpose. Better to inflict pain than to feel it. Better to be the blade than the neck. So you smiled, took notes, and nodded when the teachers praised your progress, not realizing that somewhere along the way, the line between captive and captor had vanished. And now you weren't surviving the system anymore. You were the system. They called it graduation, but nothing about it felt like an ending. The day you were released from the dormitories of Topkapi Palace and given your final assignment, you were told you had been forged by discipline and refined by education. They gave you a ceremonial robe, read aloud your new rank, and called you by a name that was no longer your own, but one you had learned to answer to. And as you stepped out of the palace gates for the first time in years, you realized something that hollowed your chest. Like wrought in wood, you had been turned into a man no one back home would recognize. You walked taller, spoke more languages, understood law, astronomy, governance. But you did not know how to touch another person without fear. You did not know how to sleep through the night without flashes of candlelight, footsteps and silk rustling in the dark. You did not know if you still believed in God, or if He had ever heard you cry out. This was your reward for surviving. Some boys, now men, were assigned to distant provinces as governors or tax collectors. Others stayed close to the imperial court as advisors, diplomats, or military strategists. But no matter how far you traveled, you carried the same invisible scars. You learned quickly that the palace had not trained you to serve, it had trained you to repeat, to replicate, to enforce. And you did, because that's what survival had become. You demanded silence from your subordinates. You looked the other way when new boys were delivered to new palaces. You signed off on records that disguised exploitation as education. You had become efficient, loyal, and useful, everything they had hoped for when they first dragged you from your mother's arms. But late at night, when the halls were quiet and the masks could come off, you saw yourself in the mirror and couldn't look for long. Because you didn't just see a man of rank, you saw every boy you had once known, every sobbing face, every hand that reached out in the dark and found nothing. And you wondered if there was still anything left inside you that hadn't been carved out and replaced. This was the legacy, not honor, not purpose, not pride, but functionality. A broken tool sharpened for someone else's empire. And the silence of your survival would echo louder than any scream you were never allowed to make. The walls are still there, marble walls polished by centuries of footsteps tourists, now not prisoners. They marvel at the domes, the gold leaf ceilings, the hand-painted tiles that whisper of Ottoman glory. Guides speak of architecture, diplomacy, conquest, of sultans and viziers and empire, but they do not speak of you. They do not speak of the 12-year-old boy dragged from a Bulgarian village, renamed, repurposed, and re-educated until he no longer recognized the sound of his own mother tongue. They do not mention the cold marble floors where you knelt in silence, learning obedience, the way others learned arithmetic. They do not talk about the price of silence, the weight of survival, the shadow cast by men who were once boys just like you, broken and rebuilt in someone else's image. You're not in the brochures. You're not in the curated displays. You're not in the triumphal retellings of imperial greatness. But you are in the walls. You are in the narrow dormitory beds and the hushed courtyards where laughter was always calculated. You are in the echo of footsteps late at night, the ones that once made boys hold their breath and pray to gods they weren't allowed to name. You are in the silence between tour guide speeches, in the blank spaces of the official records, in the smiles of painted sultans who knew exactly what was happening within their palace and chose to call it tradition. And the ghosts, your ghost, remain. They walk the halls not to haunt, but to bear witness, to remind us that history is not just glory, it is sacrifice. It is not only conquest, it is cruelty wrapped in ceremony. The palace is now a museum, but it was once a machine, a factory that took children and turned them into functionaries. It offered education, but at the cost of identity. It offered power, but only in exchange for your soul. What remains is a beautiful shell filled with unspoken suffering. And as people snap photos, admire the fountains, and praise the grandeur of Ottoman achievement, your story remains unspoken. Unless we choose to speak it, unless we choose to remember that empires are not built on marble and gold. They are built on bodies, on obedience, on boys who were never given a choice. You were not a page, not a student, not a servant. You were a sacrifice, and history owes you the truth. So what does this story leave us with? Not just the image of a child taken from his family, or the shadowed halls of Topkapi Palace, or the unspoken transactions that turned suffering into structure. What lingers is the truth of what power does when left unexamined, what it hides, what it justifies. Because this was not a story about the Ottomans alone. This was a story about what any empire, any system, any unchecked authority can become when it convinces itself that the ends glory, discipline, order justify the means. This was about how beauty can cloak brutality, how education can coexist with abuse, how names can be taken and futures rewritten in the name of something called civilization. And it's not over. Modern institutions still echo with this design, systems that favor obedience over individuality, that reward silence, punish difference, and demand loyalty at the expense of personal truth. You don't need a marble palace or a silk-robed sultan for this machinery to function. All it takes is a culture that dehumanizes the vulnerable and protects the powerful. That's why remembering matters. When we tell the story of the boy of you, we reclaim what history tries to erase. We give voice to the voiceless, dignity to the discarded, and truth to what was once shrouded in ceremony. This isn't just about the past, it's about the blueprint of control that still exists in subtle modern forms. For every empire that has risen, there are children beneath its foundation. And if we forget them, we risk becoming the next architects of silence. So remember the boy not as a victim, not as a relic, but as a mirror, reflecting what power can do when it forgets compassion, reflecting how easy it is to justify cruelty when it wears the mask of culture, reflecting how systems don't die, they evolve. And the only antidote is remembrance. Let his story haunt you. Let it disturb you. Let it remind you that the greatest evil is not always loud. Sometimes it speaks in the voice of a teacher. Sometimes it smiles like a mentor. Sometimes it calls itself tradition. And if you ever find yourself in a place that demands your silence in exchange for survival, remember you are not alone. His ghost still walks beside you, and so does the choice, to never let the truth be forgotten. The palace still stands. Marble corridors echo with the footsteps of tourists, now cameras clicking, where silence once screamed. They marvel at the architecture, admire the tilework, and breathe in the fragrance of roses blooming in manicured courtyards. But they do not hear the weeping. They do not feel the ji-chonch. Because what happened inside the Enderun was not a side story, it was the M. And this is what must be said. This wasn't simply history, it was a BLA system that showed how brilliance could be extracted through coercion, how discipline could be enforced through fear, how trauma could be mistaken for transformation, and worst of all, how entire lives could be engineered for the glory. That same logic exists today, in elite institutions, in militaries, in corporate structures that demand your soul in exchange for survival. You're given a name, a uniform, a function, but never a face, never a voice, until you forget who you were, before the system told you who you must. This is why the story matters, why he Matt. Because he was never Jew. He was thousands. His legacy is not written in gold leaf on palace walls. It's carried in silence, and now it's on us to remember, to name what was taken, to honor not the glory of the palace, but the ghosts it produced, to recognize that the cost of power, real imperial power, is almost always hidden in the children it devours. So if you walk those marble halls someday, look not only at the ceilings, look beneath your feet, for every empire that rose on the backs of children leaves footprints no polish can erase. And if no one else will speak their names, we will. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to the hidden cost of power, then don't let it fade into silence. Hit that to honor the voices history tried to erase. Share this video with someone who believes truth still matters. And subscribe to Veiled Empires, where we uncover the dark legacies empires hoped you'd forget. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. And remembrance is resistance.